Well, hey, friends. It looks like we all made it. Welcome to all of you. Despite the last 2 weeks, I'm sure being some of the strangest weeks many of us have experienced, here we all are for Sundberg-Ferrar's virtual design conversations. And now we finally get to have some fun with this whole virtual thing. And we'll get to connect with each other, share insights, and be inspired as a creative community. So we have some amazing speakers lined up for you over the next 2 afternoons. That's today and tomorrow from 12 noon to 4 p.m. Eastern time on both days. And these are leaders in their fields who will be having conversations about everything from design strategy to design for economic growth, branding, mobility, marketing, and beyond. So I'm sure you won't want to miss any of it. If you haven't had a chance yet to check out our speakers, I would strongly encourage you to do that. Just go to the link posted in the chat box right now in Zoom, and it'll take you to the event page with all of that information. By the way, my name is Linnea. I'm an industrial designer, and here at Sundberg-Ferar, I also help with our marketing and communications. So I'll be the one running the chat box during our time together. And talking about the chat box is very important for you because it's where we'll be taking all of our Q&A during this whole event, okay? So, and it's also where we'll be communicating with you as attendees and where we'll be posting links and other resources as we go along. So the chat box will be key for you to get the most out of this event and enjoy it. So that said, to get to the chat box, you just need to click on the icon at the bottom of your screen. It's pretty much right in the middle there, at the bottom of your Zoom window, and it should say chat, and that box will open up, and that's where you can type your questions for us and our speakers anytime as the event goes on. And by the way, this event is called Virtual Design Conversations for a reason, because it will all be interactive conversational time between our speakers and moderator Zivek, and with the help of questions from you. And we absolutely love to get your questions. And that's what's going to make this time the most valuable for us to learn from each other and get the most out of it. So please don't be shy. Go ahead and type your questions into the chat box. They will come directly to us and then we can answer them as we go. You can even just type something there as a test and throw it out there. So just have fun with it. And I'll also post Zivek's and my contact info in there from time to time as well. So you can feel free to send us an email if you have any questions that we don't get to during the session. We love that too. Okay, one last thing before we get started. We're almost done housekeeping things, I promise. We'd love to see you on social media. The links to Sundberg-Ferrar's LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram are in the chat box right now. So you can click on those and give us a follow, and that'll keep you updated on future webinars from our webinar series, design articles, and other great tidbits from us. Okay, those are the housekeeping things. And now that we have those out of the way, we also have Zivek here, who many of you already know. Zivek is our energetic director of strategic growth here at Sundberg-Ferar, and he's also chair of this event, and he'll be moderating the discussions today and tomorrow. So with that, I will let him take it away.
Thank you, Linnea. I'm literally the chair of the event. The chair over here. One day I wish to be the table of the event. So again, that was Linnea. Thanks for putting everything of this together, and thanks for all our speakers throughout these 2 days to come and join us and expound on their thought processes as such. So we understand the context, we understand where we are, we completely understand you might be joining us from not just your workplace, but your kitchen, your basement, or your patio, wherever you are. So we understand the context, we try to go and be responsive to it. So the entire thing is to make sure we bring something fruitfulness from the world of industrial design thinking. So that is one of the main elements. I mean, the thing is, I'm an industrial designer, so is Terry, so is Dave, or so is Linnea. So we understand design is a very important part of the entire equation, right? But design is not the only part. There are so many other elements that have to work in congruence with design. There is branding, there is marketing, there is strategy. There are so many elements as such. So today, industrial design is doing just that. Industrial designers are known to be the collaborators to bring all the voices to the table. So that's our feeble attempt to make sure we can try at least being 8 different voices to the table and try to see each and not every, but most of the point of perspectives from those experienced folks who have been in the market, been there and done that. So that's typically what we will do throughout these 2 days from 12 to 4. As such, we have around 45 minutes of every speaker, and we will divide that in a small presentation, Q&A, as Lanaya said, feel on giving us the questions as such, and we will try to make sure we will have a conversation. So the thing is, when Sundberg-Ferar, I will introduce ourselves a little bit too, but we sincerely believe when we say good design is good business. And talking about design and business, I just cannot help but think about the work done by Anne Ryan. Basically, I remember one of her books, I would say, The Atlas Shrugged. In 19, one of her characters, Richard Haley, says, if there is more tragic a fool than the businessman who himself doesn't know that he is an exponent of man's highest creative spirit, it is the artist who thinks the businessman is his enemy. And that's the main crux of it. It's not about one over either. It's basically making sure we bring in the best elements and the best nuggets of wisdom from each and every, I would say, sector, and bring it together to make sure we can make the product as such successful too. So before going there, it's not just me right now who's trying to add some thoughts from Sundberg-Ferrar's perspective. That's our beautiful team. We are a design dense team. We have been born, not all of us. The studio has born here in Detroit in 1934. And we all just work out from over there. We do not have any branch anywhere in the world or the nation, but we work from this particular element. And it's a team of design researchers, innovation strategists, engineers, industrial designers, prototyping expertise. So we bring all those elements that are required for the industrial design thinking together, and then we work with partners in various elements, and then we create solutions for I would say the industry as such. Most of you might be knowing us and our, I would say, legacy or heritage, but since 34 for last 86 years, been designing products and widgets and utensils and implements and gadgets, tools and appliances. Literally, you name it, we might have been there. This assortment of categories that we are really grateful to serve and bring our solutions together has been a part of that. You can see waffle makers and toasters till that's 1955 Packard, all the way from B2B and B2C also till today. From last mile of mobility till pots and pans, or maybe oral healthcare, and again tools. So we literally try to be in the product of where we are. Means we might be touching on this element. We did a toaster 30, 40 years ago. We did a toaster today. Objects will always be around us. People talk about vehicles, or let's say autonomous vehicles, and I don't need to buy a vehicle. You might not be buying it, but eventually you will be still using one. It might be Uber, it might be fleet based, it might be part of a different municipality system. We will always be using and doing what we will be doing with the aid of objects. How they get designed on the back end, it's a hardware model, it is a service model, it is a software model. Eventually it's always an amalgamation of all these three for any good product solution to offer. Those products are always going to be there. The way they're going to be mobilized, or the way they will be in the foundational perspective, might be different. And that's where right now, of all the times, design with business, with strategy, with research has to be, I would say, a strong coalition to get rid of the problem. So eventually, through the course of the, I would say, these 2 days, we will be trying to see how most of the things get aligned in this process. The right hand side, you might be knowing and seeing we understand about design as such. But how we start, when I say we, as a studio, at least how we start, we have some of the starting points. And marketing strategy would have a different starting point, and we will have experts talk about that too. But at least from the design perspective, we still start in the world of business. What are the ambitions? What are the aims? What are the aspirations of the business to do, right? We are there for a reason. And then how to make sure it can be squeezed in a product or services, and then eventually offered to the end user as such. So we will try to go through that as such. The thing is, I will just have 2 or 3 slides, and then we can start with Terry in 5 minutes. For these 2 days, we want to try to answer this main question: what makes your business successful, or what makes your product successful? Apart from design, what are the other elements that we need to be cognizant of? Not just as a designer, but as a business person, as a supplier, as a tier one vendor, we all need to understand what is that end, I would say, ideal experiential element that we want to look out for, and then where do we fit in? That's, I would say, the entire element of looking at anything. It might be a piece of sports or cooking, or fitness or running, which we should be doing right now more than ever. But typically, we'll try to understand how that happens, try to make sure we have a foray through design, and then get the speakers working. Because the main element here is I am completely dumbfounded by this next two slides. Every company, small, startup, or a big enterprise, it always starts with an amazing vision statements. Means go and do a scan of top 100 companies or the bottom 100 companies of Fortune 500. The vision statements are just absolutely marvelous. It's a piece of poetry, and I love poetry. I look at from that perspective too. They're really amazing. Hats off to the I would say copywriting of it. But when it comes down to the end point, that was the starting point. Everybody starts to be successful or try to help understand how they can provide their usefulness in the market. But then, at least for the USA, 85% actually is a conservative number. People say it has to be more than that. But 85% of the startups slash this, I would say, businesses fail in the first 3 years of their, I would say, existence. And that, if that's not a shame, what else it can be? Means I think we might be biased as a part of experts in the world of a design, but we think one of the main ingredient there is industrial design or industrial design thinking, I would say. But there might be other elements too. So we want to just understand in these 2 days what might be the other things that we all need to be cognizant of to make sure we do not do that. And it's not just startups. Means there's always a world of evolution, right? Between the companies, how they start up, they become established, and the vertical expansion and adjacent markets. So it might be a small uh, entrepreneurship project inside a big enterprise, or it might be just a startup out in the field having a lemonade stall. It gets that number affects everything and everybody. So it's an, I would say, an element to see how we can go and add more elements in that. So that's the entire context as such, and we will try to make sure we have a decent 10-15 minutes in between every speakers. At that time, we'll try to see how we can try to answer some of these other questions which might not fit into a speaker section, and talk a little bit more about that. And we can add a little bit more, I would say, as we go along, the day proceeds along, add a little bit more fun and entertainment value also. So having said that, and we have Terry already on the standby, what we can do is we can try to make sure we get Terry in the discussion as such. So Terry, is your mic on? No, we cannot hear you. You might have to turn your mic on. At least maybe I'm not able to hear it. No.
Hi,
Lania,
Terry.
can I hear you?
Yep, you can hear. And Terry, you might just need to call in on your cell phone again, as I think we did last time. That might work better.
Hello. So that's okay. We'll let them technically do those elements as such too. Let's go back to the element of industrial design. And Terry, let me know when you are ready. Just give a thumbs up or just start talking, and we will hear you. One of the things that design studio does is we are a human centric design studio. So we still understand, I would say, points and trigger points from way across, but eventually we make sure we come in and bring in the end user, the customer centricity as such. So when eventually we want to use all the filters and we want to take a decision, it is not that the chairman loves this color, or maybe our CDO needs to have this direction of the design because that's what he loves. No, somehow it's never that element. We try to take the subjectivity as much as out and away from it, and that's where it comes about to making sure you understand those specifications, right? You have to make sure you understand the emotional specifications that come out, rather than just, I would say, the technical or even just the business specifications as such. So that's one of the main element that we all need. And eventually it sounds pretty simple from every design studio as such, that it has to be human centric design, but how the entire articulation of the company is said and aligned to make sure they can do that, not just the design studio saying you have to be doing this and that, but how the other elements of the I would say the entire organization are aligned to make sure they can convey that through their service model as such. So that's one of the main thing that really becomes a big part of industrial design as such. The other point is people typically ask us like, how do you leverage your experience of last 86 years? And some companies may or may not have that experience as such, but the main element is the cross connection, the cross referencing, the cross pollination that happens. Means the thing I say myself, Lanea, we always say that we are so grateful to be with the companies. We literally are living in the future. By the virtue of what we do, we get to work with the future design studio of a faucet company, a future design studio of a footwear company, a future design studio of a mobility company. So there are so many elements happening in all these diverse categories, and they're also trying to envision the future over there. And somehow you try to understand and try to make anticipate what are the different elements happening in those worlds. And then we will never share secrets, but we understand the behaviors, the patterns, the subcultural trends that are coming in from those multitude of points, and then how you put together, right? And that's the main part of it. Means design and research in one thing, and we can talk about research too tomorrow a little bit, is not just cutting or in parts like the analysis part of it, but at the end what you cut and what you arrange and join or synthesize together, that is the main element. And then when you try to make sure you have to understand what works in different categories, one thing we always hear is you have to connect the dots. Yes, we have to connect the dots. We have to connect the right dots. So how to understand what right means truth is one, but righteousness is different. And then what is right for that user, for that context, still based on what the manufacturer needs to do, right? Means as not Raymond Loewy, Henry Dreyfus, or maybe it's Raymond Loewy said, I think the role of the designer is to make sure we keep the manufacturer in black, we keep the end user happy, and we also keep the estate unoffended. So all those things are pretty basic. Okay,
Okay, I think I'm
awesome,
good.
awesome. We finally made it work. So let me we'll bring you in. So the element of cross connecting is to make sure you understand those right elements and bring them together, and still have your filters to see what needs to be synthesized together. It's not just trying to look at all these subcultural trends in any categories and say, hey, let's say, look at those millennials. They're wearing some funky footwear. Let's go and design some funky vehicles for them. You cannot correspond or literally copy paste those tendencies or behaviors from one pattern, from the same person or same persona to the other. The categories itself has a different ecosystem, and it comes down to how you bring those things alive. So we can hold our thought over there, and we can continue in the next break. But thank you again, Lanea and Terry. Thank you, Terry, for being here. I think the
Sure.
people already know about your bio and they have read through it. But why don't we just start with having you introduce a little bit about yourself, about your personality, and what do you do for fun, and what keeps you inspired and motivated?
Well, I really don't have fun. I just work all the time, and I wake up, I work, I go to bed, I wake up, and I work again. Um, no, but I enjoy writing. I do a lot of writing. The last couple of years, I've also gotten back into stand-up comedy, which I used to do back in the early '80s. That was my first career ambition, was to be a stand-up comedian,
Wow.
and but that didn't work. I was a lot funnier in my head than I was coming out of my mouth. But and the '80s was a very competitive time. So anyway, I'm doing it now, and I've been having a lot more success lately than I ever had when I was young, because I've taken out a persona kind of as the cranky old guy. that seems to be working really well for me.
That's pretty interesting.
So,
That's pretty interesting. Means I think I know a lot of industrial designers, but and everybody has some kind of an amazing, I would say, element to their repertoire. But I think the first time I'm hearing stand-up comedy and industrial design coming together. If you want, for the next 15 minutes break after your session, you are free to charm us with your world of your comic integrity.
yeah, that probably won't happen, but I appreciate the invite.
Okay, no problem. One day we will have an audience just for that, and
All right, good.
we can look at that. Terence, design strategy. Means it will be great to understand a design strategy, and we will get some questions from the audience also on that perspective. But do you want to start explaining us how do you think about design strategy to start with?
Yeah, I'll do that. And I sent you some slides. You can go through those slides for me.
Yeah,
But
right now your slides are broadcasted.
okay, very good. I can see it, so I'll prompt you on that. So what I want to talk about today is design strategy, yes, but it's kind of a narrowly focused aspect of design strategy that I think sometimes, believe it or not, gets overlooked by designers, and that is form factor. The design strategy around the form factor of the product. I'm a firm believer in letting the form factor of a product speak to the consumer based on where the consumer is. Right? We all are immersed in the notion of design thinking these days, and that's great. You know, back in the 90s, we used to just call it observational analysis, you know, starting from where the consumer is, as opposed to starting from where the product, you know, takes you. But what I see a lot of designers doing, and I get lured into this sometimes too, is you get so enmeshed in the forest that you don't pay attention to the trees. And so I want to talk about that a little bit today. And how do you use the form factor that you're working to advance the strategy that you're trying to promote? So, and the whole notion there is the notion around storytelling, right? You're probably all familiar with the semantics design movement that the Cranbrook designers were popularizing back in the 80s. That's kind of the root of this, and so let's just take a look, if you will. Go to the next slide, Jivak. Let's just take a look at this. You know, as we're raised, you know, from the time we're very young, you know, we're laying in our beds as a 5-year-old, and what are we surrounded by? If you're a boy, you're surrounded by, you know, your masculine boy toys and your boy paint colors on the walls and your boy posters. And those visual images are very different than what your sister in the other room is surrounded by. And the sister is surrounded by, you know, the Barbie motifs and the soft rounded forms, the pastel colors. The boy is surrounded by the saturated colors, sharp, jagged edges on what he's looking at. And, you know, you can argue, and that's a whole discussion to have, whether or not it's you know, we do that because that's what the kids want, or the kids want it because that's what we give them, right? That's a great discussion to have. I'm not going to have that discussion now. But the reality is those influences as a very young person really influence our aesthetic judgments going forward. And so if you're designing products that are aimed at men, those forms and colors and textures that you choose are going to be very different than the forms, colors, and textures you're going to use if you're designing a product primarily for a woman. So from a strategic standpoint, understanding for whom it is you are designing the product becomes very important. And obviously, sometimes you're designing it to be ubiquitous. Okay, great. But a lot of the times you're not. And it's a continuum, right? It's not all one thing or the other. It's a continuum. And the first thing I would challenge you to do is decide where it is on that continuum that your product needs to land. Because in the end, what you really need to do to include into your design brief that you're going to be communicating to upper management with is a notion of what does success look like. Let's agree up front what a successful form factor is going to be so that we're not arguing at the end about personal preferences. And I mean, we've all been there. I certainly have. Because a lot of times, me in particular, you design the beautiful object. You design an object that you believe is going to be desirable to the consumer, but there's no basis on which to defend that in a larger context other than personal preference or personal taste. So again, having that agreement up front as to what does success look like is going to be very important. And then, Jivak, if you could go to the next slide. So another thing I would have you consider is, what is it that is going to elicit passion or desire in your audience? If you're designing a piece of electronics, for instance, are you designing this for a electronically novice consumer or a savvy consumer, an electronically savvy consumer? I go back to my mother, who passed away last year. The last couple years, trying to find a cell phone or a TV remote that she could understand and that she could use with her vision capabilities and her hearing capabilities and something she could touch and manipulate with her arthritic fingers. I mean, it was absolutely impossible. Sprint didn't even have a simple phone that would just operate in a way that she would understand. And it really led to her being isolated. It led to her not being able to change the channels on the TV for fear of pressing the wrong button and ending up in digital and then not being able to get back to where she wanted to go. So understanding for whom you're designing and what references are they going to understand, and more importantly, will they appreciate? All right, I'm showing some examples on the slide you're looking at there. The whole idea of, evocative forms that are evoking something else that they would understand. I love, it's just a concept I understand, but, the USB flash drive there, which is the shape of a file folder. File folder holds information. If I was dealing with someone who was not tech savvy, I would say, well, this holds the information. Oh yeah, well that makes sense, right? So again, design thinking here, going from where the consumer is very important. And then of course, iconic design, we all understand that. I think it's probably the most overused term I've ever heard, but because there are so few icons of design. But for those icons of design, is that notion, is hearkening to those icons something that would be appreciated by your target audience? And I think that's something to consider. Go to the next slide, Jivak. Another thing is understanding that your form communicates. Even bad forms communicate something. But if you're going to design, for instance, a product that can be very dangerous, you don't want that to look overly friendly. You don't want it to look like a toy, right? You want it to look like something that needs to be taken seriously, something that needs to be treated with a little bit of caution, right? The examples I'm showing with the lawnmower and the iron are great. I mean, you know, you wouldn't design, you know, baby's first iron in soft forms and pastel colors. That would be insane, right? Same thing with the lawnmower. You just wouldn't do that. Even if it looked great, even if it was the best looking lawnmower in the history of the world, it would be, from a strategic standpoint, it would be stupid. And that might be a little harsh. It would be unwise. So anyway, consider how your forms communicate. Back in the past, well, I won't say back in, but in the past 10, 12 years in automotive design, there has been a huge push to make automobiles look more aggressive, especially the fascias of the automobiles. You know, it wasn't long ago where you had some very friendly looking front ends. And now it seems like everybody is designing these very angry looking front ends with, you know, headlights with the, you know, with the cowls on them and the frowns on them and open teeth showing in the grill, because research has shown that most people want their cars to look somewhat aggressive. They don't want their cars to look overly friendly, because it gives them a better stance on the road. It makes people notice them. This is the perception, makes people notice them a little better. So again, it's very important knowing where the consumer is and what types of, what you want the form to communicate. The next slide, G-Mac. So, you know, I'm using rugged as an example here, right? I mean, just look at any pickup truck. Everybody's in a race to see how rugged they can make their pickup truck look, which is great, right? Everybody's doing it. But what I find fascinating is everybody's, and this is good, I'm not insulting anybody. Everybody's using the same notion of rugged, right? Truncated forms, shouldered forms. You know, these aren't soft, blended, you know, sensuous forms that you're using. And we all have an understanding, yeah, and I think we can all agree, yeah, that looks pretty rugged. You know, you look at a Tundra or an F-150, those are pretty rugged-looking vehicles, intentionally so. The strategy was to make them look rugged. And we all have a common understanding of what rugged, a visual rugged aesthetic is, right? A pile of rocks, a mountain range. A mountain range with a bunch of piles of rocks on it. I mean, those things look rugged. So that common reference becomes very important. Next slide, Jiva. Another thing to consider is from what era is your consumer coming, and what is the contemporary frame of reference that they're going to associate with. Back in the 30s, right, we all studied streamlining and design theory. But what was streamlining? Streamlining was really about making products look like they are technologically advanced, right? The DC-3 was the hearkened all this, I guess. And before you know it, the streamlining of products became ubiquitous because it was the contemporary notion of progress at the time, right? Go to the next slide. In the 50s, that all changed with the advent of the Korean War. You know, the fighter wars over Korea between the F-86 and the MiG-15. You know, that was carried in all the magazines. It was something everybody understood. And before you know it, that jet aesthetic, the jet age aesthetic, became the rage with designers. And it wasn't just a trendy thing. It was because those jet aesthetics, you know, the tail fins, the the jet engine cowlings and all that. Those are the things that communicated technology. Those are the things that communicated progress at the time. Next slide, please. You go to the 90s, or the late 90s, the same thing, the Gulf War and the stealth fighter. All of them, you have these truncated forms all over the place. That was the progress. That was technology. That was how you made something look really technological. I'm almost ashamed to admit this. When I went to design school in the early 80s, and back then the notion of technology and progress was embodied in the black box. I don't know if any of you remember this, but if you wanted to get a really good grade on your product, you would encase it in a black box. And because that was the notion of progress and technology. I just probably angered my my professors, but I think that's true. Next slide, Jivak. So the next thing to consider is what are the contemporary references? So you have all these kids in junior high and high school today that are forming their aesthetic sensibilities. Well, what are those aesthetic sensibilities that they're forming, and what are they basing that on? Right? It's not the jet fighter. It's not the DC-3. It's something else. And I could start the biggest argument, of the day here if I tried to tell you exactly what that was, because I sure don't know. But if I was sitting down to design a product for a millennial generation or a Gen Z generation, I would use an image board something like what I'm showing here, with a lot of very minimalist, pure geometry, very selective use of color. I would be very tied to this aesthetic if that was going to be my audience, and if my strategy was to communicate technology and progress. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. I've been like everybody, I've been seeing a lot of what's going on with electric cars on the road today, and the direction that designers are going with those. From a strategic standpoint, I think it's interesting that, I think we're past the point where it was only the opinion leaders that were buying electric cars. I think they're starting to become more mainstream. And sure enough, the designs of those vehicles are starting to become a little more mainstream. The second generation Leaf is not nearly as goofy as the first generation Leaf, which was screaming, hey, look at me, I'm different. Because the people buying a first generation Leaf wanted to be known for driving something different. So having a somewhat unusual design was perfect for that audience. But now as it goes more mainstream, so does the design. The Bolt is another example of that. On the counter of that, you look at the Tesla designs, which tend to be more mainstream from the beginning. Beautiful designs, to be sure, but they weren't screaming, hey, look at me, I'm different. Because what they were using as their major differentiator wasn't the form factor so much, it was the technology. And so the vehicle, the form factor of the vehicle itself, became an envelope for that technology. So in essence, the Teslas negate everything I'm saying right now, and yet they're successful. So take that for what you will. So anyway, those are some things that I think are important to consider as you develop your form factors. Because really, if you think about it, you own the form factors as designers. You own that. yes, you're involved in ergonomics. Yes, you're involved in engineering. Yes, you're involved in marketing. Yes, you're involved in, the user experience. Yes, yes, yes. But the one thing you own, the one thing that no one infringes on, is the form factor. And I'm just saying to you that forms have meaning. And that doesn't have to be looked at as, oh, I don't want to be a stylist, right? Because we all say, I don't want to be a stylist. I don't want to be just a stylist. Of course you don't. But you don't have to. You can be the champion of the form factor without being a stylist, because there's lots of strategy involved in coming up with the correct form factor. So that's what I have to say.
That is fantastic, Terry. I love. Thanks again for that energetic presentation. I like it, and I'm teaming with plenty of questions, just like I think most of our audiences too. But I think your entire, I would say, the element that we spend on the form, it recollects the quote from Peter Berhans, one of the old time, I would not say old time, the
Right.
Bauhaus kind of an father. He always said it's about creating forms that accord with the character of the object, and that's essentially the element about how to make sure you understand how it's going to put and make it look forward. In fact, I like the word about you saying we are the champions of the form factor, styling being one slice of it, but how to make sure if it works good, why can't it look good? If it looks good, why can't it help you tell you the exact meaning of why you're buying? I just
Yeah.
love that.
Because
And
it's got to be more than just about looking good, right? We can all design something that looks good, but is it right?
yeah.
Is it the right form factor? That's the question.
I like that. So, talking about right form factor, I completely understand. I think most of us would be understanding that. How would we know when to stop and when we got the right factor? Would design research then has to be a pretty integral part of finding that right? It's not the designer, it might be somebody else.
Well, all the tools that we use, to decide if we've got a good design, are still valid. But I think it starts at the beginning, coming up with a plan to know when you've reached success, right? So a successful design a successful design will hearken emotional references from the 50s, because our consumer is, elderly, blah, 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 and they would appreciate that. A successful form factor would what? And that's what you do at the beginning, so that at the end, when you're trying to decide which design to go with, you can say, well, this is a beautiful design, but it doesn't really do what we set out to do, which we all agreed was what we needed to do. So, getting the team corralled, getting those cats herded at the beginning is a vital part of it.
That's pretty interesting. And I have a couple of other questions. So, in fact, I think what you said also echoed the same thing about. I think Buckminster Fuller said, I do not start anything in the world of beauty, but at the end, if the object doesn't look beautiful, I know I have been wrong. I think that also somehow adds over there. I know for the audience and even for you, Terry, this might be way far along. Tomorrow, maybe I would like to push the camera forward. But I think you talked about the continuum. Maybe one side might be the familiar, maybe one side might be the polarizing. I'm putting a different word over there, but it might be something completely new, completely unknown, completely uncertain also. And you did mention the reference of Tesla, so I think I cannot help but ask about the Cybertruck. Means apart from the things that Tesla is doing, that most of us know in the public world, this good idiosyncratic or crazy form factor of a triangular Cybertruck. Do you want to give some of your personal thought comments on the way it's getting positioned or the way it was
Oh
unveiled?
boy, yes, I'll tell you. Yes. So the Cybertruck, someone buying a truck from Tesla, especially a truck called the Cybertruck, is not going to be the same consumer as someone buying a Chevy Silverado. They're just not going to be the same person. The person buying the truck from Tesla, it's going to be all about making a statement.
Yeah.
Right? And the person buying the truck from Chevy, it's going to be all about lifestyle. So I think there's certainly a place for the Cybertruck, whether it's a good design or not, whether it's aesthetically pleasing. I'll leave that for when I'm drunk. But for right now, I just think there's room for. I think there's room for that, the Cybertruck aesthetic. But I think it's going to be a very niche, very early adopter kind of a niche.
So in the curve that you're showing, it'll be in the first tech enthusiast, innovators kind of thing, and eventually, if followers follow the leaders, that curve might progress for that kind of a clientele.
Yeah. As people want to buy an electric truck for work, there are certain payload requirements, a certain ability to put things in the bed and take things out of the bed, and there are reasons people are buying a pickup truck that the Cybertruck may not lend itself well to.
So Terry, there are plenty of questions coming in. The board is just literally lighting up. I can just go with some of them, and we have decent time.
Sure.
A question from Mercedes. I'm surprised you put tech enthusiasts as innovators before visionaries. Can you care to explain?
No, I can't explain that other than no, that was not as well. That particular question, the answer to that wouldn't be all that well thought through. I didn't do that all that intentionally.
Okay, that's okay. I think a question from the design world as such, like you're a designer, I'm albeit also a designer, but do all designers take this strategic approach intuitively? I think the key word is intuitiveness is here.
I think every designer is intuitive to a certain level. We all do this. We all try to make our form have meaning intuitively. I believe that. We all do. But to have that intuitively doesn't help you, right? Your strategy needs to be articulated, and the team needs to agree to that strategy so that you know what you're designing to. And again, at the end, everyone can agree to whether or not the design is successful.
That makes sense. So another question coming here, which might be a little bit more into the future. Aren't we too close to contemporary influences to know what is influencing consumers today? So we are also living in the same, I would say, same pot of time. How do you go beyond?
Absolutely, we are too close. As an example of what I'm talking about there, the iPhone, right? Everybody's got an iPhone. Great. So why is the iPhone successful? Again, everybody's going to have an answer to that. The iPhone is a very minimalist design, right? Very few details, very little or no decoration, right? It's all about the user interface. So is the iPhone successful because it's a minimalist design? Can we extrapolate that because people like the iPhone, they like minimalist design? Or is it successful because of the user interface? Because the user interface is so intuitive and works so well, and the product has so many functions, right? Is the iPhone successful in spite of its minimalist design? I don't know. Yet every design student I know, and I've taught design for many, many years, they gravitate towards that aesthetic as their first choice, right? And it's obviously having an influence. It's having an influence on designers, at least young designers. But what do you extrapolate from that? I don't know yet. So yes, we are too close.
Yes, and maybe a formalized design training that designers do when they go to Art Center or CCS or SCAD or Auburn. That's where they, I would say, get trained to think about this and do experimentation in those 4 years, 5 years
Yeah.
as such, and then go beyond. So somehow I would say people like us are, let's say, people like industrial designers are trained to do just that. It depends on how the individual wants to liberate his or her more
Yeah.
skills. There's one more question from John, sir. Let's try to at least go with the first part of it. The process of determining, I think you were mentioning about the planning part of it, right? How does success look like? How you understand in the front? The process of determining or deciding the successful form factor could become very, very political, and might be, this might be for bigger companies. So how do you, you have been in big companies, small companies, how do you think about grappling that, whether the decision should not be political?
Well, like anything else, data talks. There's a whole lot of really, really effective research out there on some of the things I'm talking about here. I'm not just making up, this notion that, girls like a certain aesthetic that is different than what boys like. I mean, that's very well documented. I'm not making up the notion that aggressive looking front ends on cars generally sell better than aggressive looking, front ends or friendly looking front ends on cars. So, pulling that data out, and, you can also take focus groups of your target audience and run images by them to see where they gravitate, and then use that as data to support what you're going to do. Right? I mean, I could show, sense. For instance, I could show 100 products to people, ranging from very minimalist to very decorated, very, very ornate, and you could see where your target audience is going to fall. If you had a bunch of 60-year-old farmers, you would get a very different answer than if you had a bunch of 30-year-old New Yorkers, right? And so understanding who your audience is, you can capture a notion of where their aesthetic judgments are going in.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, and we may or may not have time to go into that, but from our studio, we have always thought about this as a pretty important differentiator, and you may or may not have been seen. We also have a process called MAPS, the measuring adoption propensity for styling selection. So apart from the other elements that come into the process of how you decide what you need to decide, from the usefulness, for the usability, for the ergonomics, all those things. But when it comes to the visual form factor, the aesthetics, the visual architecture as such, it's pretty a hard element. And maybe we do not have a specific design research slot in these 2 days, but maybe next month we can do something else and we can talk about that.
Sure.
And we can have our design research manager, Sarah Dickerson, talk about that, because what you say is pretty important truth about how do you making a statement, but again, well begun is half done. And no matter what, somehow in this world, means, let's say in the world of earlier world, let's say we showed some vehicles, Volt or F-150 or Rivian as such, means over there also the first thing you see the vehicle zoom by, and then you understand what it is, and eventually you walk 30 feet to it, 3 feet to it, and then I would say the design starts to grow on you. The first capture of what you see happens in the visual world. I think we all, not we all know, but there's a fact that about 80% of what we know and what we sense in this world is through our visual cortex. So 80% is really visually based, and then that particular thing immediately starts talking with you. Means we have been evolved to look at, I would say, things and try to see whether, hey, it is warm and cuddly and cute. Hey, it's a rabbit behind the bushes. But hey, it's something dangerous, something sharp, maybe a saber-tooth tiger behind those trees. So we always have come to the referencing of form looks, and then how to make sure we derive meaning out of it also. Uh,
Yeah.
The other part, I think, about design, you talked about design research to get that thing, allowed. That was pretty interesting to see how we plan the entire context together. Let's try to go with other questions as such.
Do we have time? I know it might be going over here.
Yeah, we are still 5 minutes,
Okay,
pretty
all right.
pretty safely as such. So another question from Michael. Let's say you are. I'm trying to paraphrase now. It's a pretty long question. You are. Let's say you are now the pioneer of this new form factor, and you own this new definition. How do you, or if do not, try to convince the rest of the industry to worship this new form? Do you want them now, them to follow you, or you want still to be distinct? So what's the next stage once you, let's say, invent, create, and manifest your own form factor? What happens then? How do you monetize it?
If you've done it correctly, and there's more than one way to do it correctly, but if you are successful, the monetization of it is going to be automatic in increased sales or high sales to the audience for whom the design is intended. It may not be, especially well appreciated by the larger audience, which is perfectly okay. Again, if I was designing a product for my mother, it would be a different product than it would have a different form factor than a product I would be designing for my nieces and nephews. And if my nieces and nephews are 20% of the population, but it resonates well with them, and that's who it's designed for, then that's success, even though 80% of the people may not appreciate it all that much.
Yep.
So, that's why I've always had a little bit of a problem with design awards and whatnot, because there used to be a joke about IDEA awards, and that it was the biggest kiss of death. You win an IDEA award, and then the product doesn't do well on the market. And I think a lot of that is because designers too often design for designers and not for whom they are targeting the product. Just something to consider. I know that will start an argument, but
No. That's pretty interesting. Personally, it's very interesting to me because, and we can talk. Actually, that's a great topic. We can talk it later in the day. But just as a not a disclaimer, as a disclosure for the audiences, I sit on the IDSA board, which runs the IDEA award, and good, bad, or otherwise. This year, I'm one of the jury for the IDA award. But what you say has its own true meaning too. So we always consider that, because sometimes you have to make sure, as you completely said, coming back to the main discussion, we have to understand we did not invent problems that people don't have. As you said, we have to go to the tribe of your users, really see what do they want. Are they in New York City, or are they in Idaho farmers? We have to make sure we go there and not try to think or second guess what do they want. So it all comes down to how sharply, how deeply, how I would say intentionally and carefully you understand what they need. Designer is not the user. Yeah, I can drive a truck, so can you, but you have to understand what does a real cowboy or a fake cowboy want from that truck. So that's pretty interesting. I think the other element that you mentioned was, and I know this may or may not completely see, but what you were mentioning is, uh, let's say, or how to add to what you were saying is, if we want to go and ask a company, like, okay, let's try to see what your end persona, your target segment wants. And let's say how much you market you want to please, 2%. Okay, let's make it 4% of the global. Let's make it 8% of the global market. Would you be happy? The CFO always says, absolutely. That will make everybody a billionaire, them and us too. So let's say you have this 8% of the market over here. So in a way, I think what we all need to, maybe that might be seen or might not be, in a way, what we can always make sure is we can design for this 8% of the market. In that perspective, the rest of the 92% market, if they hate your product, it's completely okay, because you're still staying true to what design research you're grasped with. I think that also tells a lot about how you invest into design research. Nowadays, in the next 3 or 4 months, it might not be qualitative, it might be quantitative, but you still have to make sure you understand that. And the sooner you do, the sooner you go out to the schools, to the actual places, it might be Home Depot or Lowe's or actual people's kitchens and bathrooms, the better it is. We are almost there, but maybe we can take maybe one question as such. Right now, the world is listening. This question comes from India. It's from Rahul. Uh, can this form-based design strategy work well for value-based market? Example, in India, and I think I can attest that, I was born over there, people shortlist cars based on their budget. It might be budget, or it has to be a gas, not a gas guzzler or something. So first they shortlist on the budget or their first value, and then they go on to choose the cars they like. So the form factor comes way down. So how does it might work in those particular markets?
Boy, that's a,
Oh, it's
um,
it's a good
yeah,
question.
that's a good one. Boy, what?
If
I
you're
work
okay, I
for
can
a,
try to attempt to start answering that, and then you can join in. Would that be okay?
yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, Rahul, that's a great question, and it's an eternal tussle about I would say the value options that you want to come in. The element here is again comes back to what earlier Terry or I was saying about making sure you understand the end user. So when we will be doing design research, we will be still considering about form, but we still try to go and understand their successful equation. And if let's say mileage comes on the top, or it's a durability comes on the top, it will still be addressed. But once you address that, let's say Terry drives an amazing Ford F-150, I drive a Prius. Okay, if I am driving a Prius, I want to have it 55 gallons per miles per gallon. That's perfectly okay. If I am that, then make sure not just the form, not just but the entire alignment of all the journey touch points also will be in that kind of an paradigm. So then that sub brand of what the exchange is going to happen for will not just be in the form, but once you understand what it is, then try to make sure everything is catered to that particular perspective. And I would say, again, depends on aesthetics and the values thereof, as Terry was mentioning. If you are going to sell a vehicle that happens to be a Prius kind of a vehicle, then make sure everything falls into a packet for that. The similar thing will happen on the other end of the spectrum, maybe a little bit more stronger for the F-151. So all comes down to understanding the tribe and putting the function and form of together at that particular time. Terry, I would like you
Yeah.
to take it from there.
Do you want me to comment on what you just said?
Not for me. If you want to add something to Rahul's question.
Oh, well, yeah, it's understanding your audience. Now, I work for a Indian company. I've been to India quite a few times, and one of the things I noticed is that both in the homegrown automobiles that are designed in India, as well as a lot of the other products, there is a great appreciation for ornamentation. Much, much more so than you would see in Europe or in the United States, right? The notion of decorating surfaces is very popular in India. So designing forms for an Indian market, I'm saying this without having done any research on this, but my hypothesis would be that I would appreciate the notion of putting decoration and more ornamental forms on a product that I was designing for the Indian market than I would if I was designing it for Europe or US.
That makes sense. Awesome. Thank you again. I think we are just a little bit over time. That's perfectly okay. But before I go, Terry, thank you. And apart from what we talked about, form or design or GenZe or anything else, do you have any parting words of wisdom for our audiences? Means you are pretty successful. You are a great designer. You are where you are. what might be those 2 or 3 attributes that you would want people to, let's say, gather or
Yeah.
focus on as they go forward? Because some of our audiences is pretty young. They might be in the earlier form of a design career, or they might be students also.
Well, the number one thing I would word of advice I would give is don't forget who the designer is, right? And don't forget what your number one responsibility is. And don't shy away from the notion of styling. Don't be ashamed of styling, all right? Use that, but use it intelligently. Have a strategy behind what you're doing, because no one else is going to design that form factor. No one else. It's you. So take pride in that, and don't try to be a bad engineer. Don't try to be a mediocre ergonomist, or to talk about user experience design when you don't know a lot about user experience design just because you think you're adding value by doing that. No, your value, your number one value, is in the form factor and the surface materials and color and all that. But that's where you bring the most value. Don't shy away from it.
Awesome. Thank you once again, Terry, for your time. We had many more questions, and maybe we can try to make a list of questions and then circulate that to our panelists.
Okay.
And if somebody wants to take time, we can answer them. But thank you again, and have an enjoyable afternoon. You can log
Thank
off
you.
whenever you want, or you can just keep on hearing with your video and mic off.
Okay. Very good.
Awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.